The next morning, Sarah woke up with a sense of determination she hadn't felt in months. She made breakfast for Emma and Jake, packed their lunches, and drove them to school as usual. But instead of heading home afterward, she turned her car toward Blackwood Forest. The drive took about 20 minutes on winding mountain roads. As she got closer to the forest, Sarah noticed that the houses became fewer and farther apart. The last house she passed was at least 2 miles from the forest entrance, and it looked abandoned. Broken windows stared out like empty eyes, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. Sarah parked her car at the old Forest Service road that led into Blackwood Forest. There was a rusted sign that read, "Trail closed. Enter at your own risk." Someone had spray-painted additional words underneath. "Stay away" and "Danger." The paint was fresh, suggesting that people still came here specifically to warn others. She grabbed her backpack, which contained water, a flashlight, her phone, and a camera. The trail was obviously not maintained anymore. Branches hung low across the path, and in some places Sarah had to push through thick undergrowth. But the trail was still visible, worn down by decades of hikers who had come before the area was abandoned. As Sarah walked deeper into the forest, she began to understand why people found this place unsettling. The trees grew unusually close together, blocking out much of the sunlight even though it was the middle of the day. The forest was also strangely quiet. She didn't hear any birds singing or small animals moving through the underbrush. The only sound was her own footsteps on the leaf-covered ground. After walking for about an hour, Sarah came to a small clearing. In the center stood the cabin that had generated so much fear and mystery in Pine Ridge. Her first thought was that it looked completely ordinary. It was a simple log structure, probably built in the 1960s or 1970s. The roof had some missing shingles, and the front porch sagged slightly, but the cabin was in much better condition than she had expected. What struck Sarah as odd was how clean the area around the cabin looked. Despite being abandoned for decades, there was no trash or graffiti. The windows were intact, and the front door appeared to be in good condition. It was as if someone had been taking care of the place, even though everyone claimed it was completely abandoned. Sarah approached the cabin slowly, taking pictures with her camera. She walked around the entire structure, looking for any obvious signs of why people might fear this place. The back of the cabin faced a small stream, and there was what looked like an old vegetable garden that had long since been reclaimed by wild plants. When she tried to look through the windows, Sarah found that they were covered from the inside with what appeared to be newspaper or some other kind of paper. She couldn't see anything inside the cabin. The front door had a simple padlock, but it looked new, not 40 years old. Sarah was examining the lock when she heard a sound that made her freeze. It was a low humming noise, almost like someone singing a lullaby. The sound seemed to be coming from inside the cabin. She pressed her ear against the door and listened carefully. The humming continued for about 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. Her heart was beating fast, but Sarah forced herself to think logically. The sound could have been wind moving through the cabin, or maybe an animal had gotten inside. She walked around the cabin again, looking for any other way to see inside or any sign that someone was living there. That's when she noticed the footprints. In a soft patch of dirt near the back door, there were several sets of footprints. They looked fresh, probably made within the last few days. Some were large, like those of an adult man, but others were smaller. Sarah knelt down to examine them more closely and felt a chill run down her spine. Some of the smaller footprints looked like they could have been made by children. Sarah took pictures of the footprints and then decided she had seen enough for one day. She was starting to feel uneasy, and she wanted to get back to town before Emma and Jake got out of school. As she walked back toward her car, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about what she had discovered. The cabin wasn't abandoned at all. Someone was definitely using it, and that someone might be bringing children there. When Sarah got home, she immediately called the Pine Ridge Police Department. Officer Martinez listened to her story with interest, but he seemed reluctant to take action. "Mrs. Mitchell, I appreciate you calling this in," he said, "but we've investigated that cabin several times over the years. We've never found any evidence of criminal activity. The land is privately owned, and the owner has the right to visit his property." "But what about all the stories people tell about that place?" Sarah asked. "And why does everyone act so frightened when I mention it?" Officer Martinez was quiet for a moment. "Look, I've lived here my whole life," he finally said. There have been some strange incidents over the years, but nothing we could ever prove. My advice is to stay away from that area. There are plenty of other places for you and your family to explore." Sarah hung up the phone feeling frustrated. It seemed like everyone in Pine Ridge was part of some conspiracy of silence about the cabin. But she was more determined than ever to find out the truth. That evening, she made a decision that would put her entire family in danger. She would return to the cabin, but this time she wouldn't go alone. She would bring Emma, Jake, and Max with her. If someone was using that cabin for illegal purposes, especially involving children, she needed to gather real evidence. And despite all the warnings, Sarah believed that knowledge was always better than ignorance, especially when it came to protecting her own children. Sarah Mitchell had always been the type of woman who faced challenges head-on. When her husband died in a car accident 3 years ago, she didn't crumble. Instead, she packed up her life, sold their house in the city, and moved to the small mountain town of Pine Ridge with her 8-year-old twins, Emma and Jake, and their loyal German shepherd. The locals in Pine Ridge were friendly enough, but Sarah noticed something strange. Whenever she mentioned wanting to explore the old hiking trails near Blackwood Forest, conversations would suddenly stop. Eyes would dart away, and people would quickly change the subject. It wasn't until she met Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store that she learned about the cabin. Mrs. Henderson was stocking shelves when Sarah asked about good camping spots for families. The elderly woman's face went pale, and she gripped Sarah's arm with surprising strength. "Stay away from the old Blackwood cabin," she whispered urgently. "That place has been cursed for 40 years. Nobody goes there anymore, and for good reason." Sarah tried to get more information, but Mrs. Henderson just shook her head and walked away quickly. This reaction puzzled Sarah even more. She had moved to Pine Ridge for a fresh start, and to give her children a chance to experience nature and adventure. The idea that there was some forbidden place in their new hometown only made her more curious. That evening, Sarah decided to do some research. She visited the local library and asked the librarian, Mr. Collins, about the history of Blackwood Forest. Mr. Collins was a man in his 60s who had lived in Pine Ridge his entire life. When Sarah mentioned the cabin, his friendly demeanor changed instantly. "You don't want to know about that place," he said firmly. "Some things are better left alone. There are plenty of other beautiful spots around here for you and your family to explore." But Sarah was determined. She spent hours going through old newspapers and local history books. What she found made her even more intrigued. There were brief mentions of strange incidents dating back to the 1980s. Hikers reported hearing unexplained sounds coming from the abandoned cabin. Some claimed to see lights flickering in the windows late at night. Even though the place had been empty for decades, the most disturbing story she found was from 1983. A family of 4 had gone missing while camping near the cabin. They were found 3 days later, wandering the forest in a confused state. None of them could remember what had happened during those 3 days. The local newspaper described their condition as mentally disturbed, and mentioned that they left town immediately after being found. When Sarah got home that night, she found Emma and Jake playing with Max in the backyard. They were such bright, curious children, always asking questions about their new surroundings. She watched them laugh as Max chased a tennis ball, and she felt a familiar pang of worry. As a single mother, every decision felt magnified. She wanted to give her children experiences and adventures, but she also needed to keep them safe. "Mom, can we go camping this weekend?" Emma asked, running up to her with grass stains on her knees. "Jake found this really cool map at school that shows all the trails around here." Jake nodded enthusiastically, holding up a hand-drawn map that one of his classmates had given him. Sarah's heart sank when she saw a small cabin drawn in red ink at the edge of the forest, with the words, "Do not go here," written in capital letters underneath. "Where did you get this map?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Tommy Peterson drew it," Jake explained. "He said his dad used to be a park ranger and he knows all the best spots. But he said we should never, ever go to this cabin. He wouldn't tell us why, though. Even the children in town knew about the mysterious cabin." Sarah felt frustrated by all the secrecy. She was a rational woman with a background in journalism. She believed in facts, not superstitions. The more people told her to stay away from the cabin, the more she wanted to understand what was really going on. That night, after putting the twins to bed, Sarah sat on her porch with a cup of tea and looked toward the dark outline of Blackwood Forest in the distance. Max lay at her feet, his ears occasionally perking up at sounds from the woods. The forest looked peaceful under the starlight, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it was hiding something important. She made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow she would drive to the edge of Blackwood Forest and see this mysterious cabin for herself. She wouldn't take the children, of course. This would just be a quick scouting trip to satisfy her curiosity and put an end to all the speculation. Sarah had no idea that her decision to investigate the cabin would lead to the most terrifying and transformative experience of her family's life. The secrets hidden in Blackwood Forest were far more complex and dangerous than anything the townspeople had ever whispered about. And soon, Sarah, Emma, Jake, and Max would find themselves at the center of a mystery that had remained unsolved for decades. Sarah spent the rest of the week planning her return trip to the cabin. She told Emma and Jake that they would be going on a special camping adventure on Saturday, but she didn't mention their specific destination. She wanted to see the cabin again, this time with fresh eyes and more time to investigate properly. On Friday evening, Sarah packed camping gear, food, and supplies for an overnight trip. She also packed a crowbar, reasoning that if the cabin was truly abandoned, she had a right to look inside and see what was causing all the mysterious stories. Max seemed to sense that something exciting was happening and followed her around the house, wagging his tail. Emma and Jake were thrilled about the camping trip. They had been begging Sarah to take them on a real outdoor adventure since they moved to Pine Ridge. They spent Friday night looking at their sleeping bags and camping equipment, making lists of all the things they wanted to do in the forest. Saturday morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for hiking. Sarah loaded the car with their gear and drove toward Blackwood Forest, taking a different route this time. She had studied local maps and found a Forest Service road that would get them closer to the cabin without having to hike the main trail. "Where exactly are we going, Mom?" Emma asked as they drove through increasingly remote countryside. "There's an old cabin in the forest that I want to explore," Sarah said carefully. "It's been abandoned for a long time and I thought it might be interesting to see." Jake looked up from his comic book. "Is it the cabin that Tommy Peterson told us about? The one we're not supposed to go to?" Sarah felt a moment of doubt. Maybe she was making a mistake bringing her children to a place that clearly made the entire town nervous. But she pushed the feeling aside. She was their mother, and she had always taught them to face their fears with knowledge and preparation. "Yes, it's that cabin," she said. "But Tommy and his family are just being superstitious. There's nothing dangerous about an old empty building. We're going to explore it together and see what all the fuss is about." Max was sitting in the back seat between the twins, and Sarah noticed that he became restless as they got closer to Blackwood Forest. He started panting and whining, which was unusual behavior for him. Max was normally calm and well-behaved on car trips. They parked at the Forest Service road and began hiking toward the cabin. Sarah had marked the route on her map, and she estimated it would take about 45 minutes to reach their destination. The twins were excited and energetic, pointing out interesting rocks and plants along the way. Max walked beside them, but Sarah noticed that his ears were constantly alert, as if he was listening for something they couldn't hear. As they got deeper into the forest, Emma began to notice the unusual quiet. "Mom, why aren't there any birds singing?" she asked. Sarah had wondered the same thing during her first visit. "Sometimes forests are just quiet," she said. "Maybe the birds are resting." But Jake, who was usually full of chatter, had become unusually subdued. He stayed close to Sarah and kept looking over his shoulder, as if he expected someone to be following them. When they reached the clearing where the cabin stood, all three of them stopped and stared. In the bright morning sunlight, the cabin looked even more ordinary than it had during Sarah's first visit. It was just an old log building surrounded by trees. "It doesn't look scary at all," Emma said, sounding almost disappointed. But Max had a very different reaction. As soon as he saw the cabin, he began growling low in his throat. The fur on his back stood up, and he positioned himself between the family and the building. Sarah had never seen Max react this way to anything before. "What's wrong with Max?" Jake asked, reaching down to pet the dog. But Max stepped away from Jake's hand, never taking his eyes off the cabin. Sarah felt a chill of unease, but she forced herself to stay calm. Dogs sometimes reacted to smells or sounds that humans couldn't detect. Maybe Max could smell wild animals that had been living in or around the cabin. "Let's set up our camp over here," Sarah said, pointing to a flat area about 50 yards away from the cabin. "Then we'll explore the building together." They unpacked their gear and set up their tent. The twins were excited about sleeping outdoors, and they quickly forgot about Max's strange behavior. But Sarah kept watching the dog, and she noticed that he refused to relax. He sat facing the cabin, alert and tense. After lunch, Sarah decided it was time to investigate the cabin. She had brought the crowbar, and she was determined to get inside and see what was causing all the mystery. The twins followed her eagerly, but Max hung back, whining softly. When they reached the front door, Sarah examined the padlock again. It was definitely new, and it looked expensive. Someone was clearly trying to keep people out of this cabin, but why? Sarah positioned the crowbar and was about to break the lock when Emma grabbed her arm. "Mom, look," Emma whispered, pointing toward one of the windows. Sarah turned and felt her blood run cold. The newspaper covering the inside of the window had shifted slightly, and she could see a narrow gap. Through that gap, someone was watching them. She caught a glimpse of a pale face and dark eyes before the newspaper was quickly readjusted to block the view. "There's someone inside," Jake said in a scared voice. Sarah's mind raced. If someone was living in the cabin, then all the stories and warnings suddenly made sense. But who would choose to live in such an isolated place? And why would their presence frighten an entire town? Max was now barking frantically, and the sound echoed through the quiet forest. Sarah made a quick decision. They needed to leave immediately and call the police from town. Whatever was going on at this cabin, it was clearly more than just local superstition. "Kids, we're going back to the tent right now," Sarah said firmly. "We're packing up and leaving." But as they turned to go, they heard the front door of the cabin open with a loud creak. Someone was coming out. Sarah instinctively moved to shield Emma and Jake behind her as the cabin door opened fully. What emerged was not what any of them had expected. A thin, elderly man with long gray hair and a beard stepped onto the porch. He was wearing clean but worn clothing, and he moved slowly, as if he was very tired or in pain. "Please don't be afraid," the man said in a gentle voice. "I know you must be startled to find someone here." Max continued barking, but the man didn't seem threatening. In fact, he looked more frightened than they were. His hands were shaking, and he stayed on the porch, making no move to approach them. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We didn't know anyone was living here. We were told this cabin was abandoned." The man smiled sadly. "It has been abandoned in a way. My name is Henry Blackwood. This cabin belonged to my family for 3 generations. I've been living here alone for the past 10 years. Are you the owner that Officer Martinez mentioned?" Sarah asked, remembering her conversation with the police. Henry nodded. "I suppose I am, though I doubt many people in town would acknowledge my right to be here. I'm afraid my reputation in Pine Ridge is quite complicated." Emma stepped out from behind Sarah. She had always been the braver of the twins, and her curiosity was stronger than her fear. "Why does everyone in town act scared when they talk about this place?" Henry looked at Emma with kind eyes. "That's a long story, young lady, and not a very pleasant one. Would you like to sit down? I think I owe you an explanation, especially since you've come all this way." Sarah hesitated. Every instinct told her to pack up and leave immediately. But Henry seemed harmless, and she was more curious than ever about the mystery surrounding this place. Max had stopped barking, though he remained alert and suspicious. "I suppose we could talk for a few minutes," Sarah said carefully. "But we can't stay long." Henry gestured toward some old wooden chairs on the cabin's porch. "Please make yourselves comfortable. I don't get many visitors, as you might imagine." As they settled into the chairs, Henry began his story. 40 years ago, I was a very different person. I was young and angry and made some terrible mistakes. I was involved in an incident that hurt several people, including children. I went to prison for 15 years. Sarah felt a surge of alarm and automatically pulled Emma and Jake closer to her. But Henry continued speaking in his calm, sad voice. "When I was released, I had nowhere to go. My family had disowned me, and everyone in Pine Ridge hated me for what I had done. So I came here, to this old cabin that my grandfather built, and I've been trying to make amends ever since." "What kind of incident?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Henry was quiet for a long moment. "I was drinking heavily in those days, and I was driving when I shouldn't have been. I hit a family's car on the mountain road. A father and mother were killed, and their 2 children were badly injured. It was the worst thing I've ever done, and I think about it every single day." Jake, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Is that why people are afraid of you?" "Partly. Henry said. But the fear has grown over the years into something much bigger than the truth. People in town tell stories about this place being haunted or cursed. They say I practice dark magic or that I hurt children who come here. None of that is true, but fear has a way of growing when people don't understand something. Sarah felt a wave of sympathy for Henry, but she was still cautious. Why do you stay here if it causes so much fear in the community? Henry stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. Because this is the only place I can do any good. You see, over the years, some young people have found their way here. Teenagers who are running away from home, children who are being hurt by their families, people who have nowhere else to go. I help them. I give them food and shelter and a safe place to stay until they can figure out their next step. The footprints, Sarah said suddenly, remembering what she had seen during her first visit. Yes, Henry said. Just last week, a 15-year-old girl named Maria came here. She was running away from an abusive stepfather. I fed her, let her rest, and then I helped her contact her aunt in another state. The aunt came and picked her up 2 days ago. Emma was studying Henry's face carefully. So you're like a helper person? I try to be, Henry said. I know I can never undo the harm I caused 40 years ago, but I can try to prevent other people from being hurt. It's not much, but it's all I can do. Sarah was beginning to understand the complexity of the situation. Henry wasn't the monster that people in town believed him to be. But his presence here, combined with his past, had created a mythology that grew more frightening with each telling. How do these young people find you? Sarah asked. Henry smiled for the first time since they had met him. Word gets around among kids who need help. They tell each other that there's a safe place in Blackwood Forest. They know they can come here and no one will ask too many questions or force them to go back to dangerous situations. Max had gradually relaxed during their conversation. He was now lying at Jake's feet, though he continued to watch Henry carefully. Dogs were usually good judges of character, and Max's acceptance of Henry made Sarah feel more comfortable. But why don't you try to rebuild your relationship with the town? Sarah asked. If people knew what you were really doing here, maybe they wouldn't be so afraid. Henry shook his head sadly. I've tried over the years, but the fear is too deep now. And honestly, the fear serves a purpose. It keeps casual visitors away, which makes this place safer for the young people who really need help. If everyone knew this was just a refuge, it might lose its effectiveness. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself drawn into Henry's story. He showed them the inside of the cabin, which was simple but clean and comfortable. There were several sleeping areas, a well-stocked kitchen, and shelves lined with books. It was clearly the home of someone who cared about helping others. But as evening approached, Sarah knew they needed to make a decision. Should they stay the night as planned, or should they pack up and leave? The old Sarah might have left immediately, prioritizing safety over everything else. But something about Henry's story and his obvious loneliness made her want to stay and learn more. Little did Sarah know that their decision to spend the night at the cabin would lead to an encounter that would change all of their lives forever. As the sun began to set over Blackwood Forest, Sarah made the decision to stay. Henry had offered to cook dinner for them, and the twins were fascinated by his stories about the different people he had helped over the years. Despite his troubled past, Sarah sensed that Henry was genuinely trying to make a positive difference in the world. They moved their camping gear closer to the cabin, and Henry helped them set up their tent in a more sheltered spot. Max seemed to have fully accepted Henry's presence and was even allowing the old man to pet him. Sarah took this as a good sign, since Max had always been protective of the family. Henry proved to be an excellent cook. He prepared a simple but delicious meal of soup and fresh bread, which they ate on the cabin's porch as darkness fell. Emma and Jake peppered Henry with questions about his life in the forest, and he answered them patiently and honestly. Don't you get lonely out here by yourself? Emma asked. Sometimes, Henry admitted, but I have plenty to keep me busy. I maintain the cabin, I read books, and I tend a small garden behind the house. And when someone needs help, I'm here for them. What's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you in the forest? Jake wanted to know. Henry thought about this question seriously. About 5 years ago, I found a little boy who had gotten lost during a family hiking trip. He was only 6 years old, and he had been wandering in the forest for almost 2 days. He was scared and hungry and cold. That was scary for me because I knew how much danger he was in, and I had to get him back to his family quickly. What did you do? Sarah asked. I fed him and got him warm, and then I carried him back toward the main trail. I left him in a spot where the search party would find him, and then I went back to the cabin. I heard later that he was reunited with his family, and that he was fine. Sarah realized that Henry's story matched something she had read in the old newspaper archives. There had been a brief article about a lost child who was found after 2 days in Blackwood Forest. The article mentioned that the boy claimed a nice man in the woods had helped him, but the authorities had dismissed this as the imagination of a frightened child. After dinner, they sat around a small campfire that Henry built near their tent. The forest around them was completely dark and quiet except for the crackling of the fire. Sarah felt more peaceful than she had in months. There was something calming about being away from the noise and stress of everyday life. But their peaceful evening was interrupted. Around 10 o'clock, when Max suddenly stood up and began growling toward the trees, Henry immediately became alert, listening carefully to the darkness around them. "What is it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Someone's coming," Henry whispered. "Max hears them before we do." A few minutes later, they could hear the sound of footsteps moving through the forest. Someone was approaching the cabin, but they were trying to move quietly. Henry stood up and gestured for Sarah and the twins to stay by the fire. "Hello," Henry called out toward the darkness. "You're welcome here if you need help." There was a long silence, and then a young voice answered from the trees. "Are you Henry?" "Yes, I am." "You're safe here. Come into the light so we can see you." A teenage girl stepped into the circle of firelight. She appeared to be about 16 years old, and she was carrying a backpack. Her clothes were dirty and she looked exhausted and scared. "My name is Lisa," she said. "Someone told me I could find help here." Henry's demeanor immediately became gentle and protective. "Of course, Lisa, are you hungry? Do you need a place to sleep?" Lisa nodded and Sarah could see tears in her eyes. "I've been walking for 2 days. I don't have anywhere else to go." Sarah watched as Henry quickly went into action. He brought Lisa food and water, and he set up a sleeping area for her inside the cabin. He spoke to her quietly, asking gentle questions about her situation and what kind of help she needed. It turned out that Lisa was running away from a foster home where she was being mistreated. She had heard from other teenagers that there was a safe place in Blackwood Forest where someone would help her without asking too many questions or forcing her to return to dangerous situations. "I can call social services for you," Henry offered. "There are good people there who can help you find a better placement." "I've tried that before," Lisa said sadly. "They always send me back to the same kind of places. At least here I feel safe." Sarah was moved by the interaction between Henry and Lisa. She could see that this was not the first time Henry had dealt with this kind of situation. He clearly had experience helping young people in crisis, and he treated Lisa with genuine kindness and respect. As Lisa settled in for the night, Henry returned to the campfire where Sarah and the twins were waiting. Emma and Jake had listened to the entire conversation with wide eyes. "Does this happen often?" Sarah asked. "Maybe once or twice a month," Henry said. "Word spreads among kids who are having problems. They know they can come here and be safe while they figure out their next step." Sarah was beginning to understand why Henry had chosen to stay in this isolated place despite all the fear and hostility from the town. He had found a way to use his solitude and his reputation to help people who had nowhere else to turn. "This is why you don't want the townspeople to know the truth about what you're doing here," Sarah said. Henry nodded. "If everyone knew this was a refuge, it would lose its effectiveness. The fear and mystery actually serve a purpose. They keep away casual visitors and people who might cause trouble, but they don't stop the young people who really need help." As they prepared to go to sleep, Sarah reflected on everything she had learned. The cursed cabin that everyone in Pine Ridge feared was actually a place of safety and hope for young people in desperate situations. Henry, the man everyone believed to be dangerous, was risking his own safety and comfort to help others. But Sarah's understanding of the situation was about to become even more complicated. Tomorrow morning would bring a revelation that would force her to make the most difficult decision of her life. Sarah woke up early the next morning to the sound of voices outside the tent. Through the thin fabric, she could hear Henry talking to someone, but she couldn't make out the words. Emma and Jake were still sleeping, and Max was lying quietly beside them, though his ears were alert. Sarah quietly unzipped the tent and stepped outside. Henry was standing near the cabin with Lisa and another person Sarah hadn't seen before. It was a middle-aged woman with short brown hair wearing a social worker's badge on her jacket. "Mrs. Mitchell," Henry called softly when he saw her. "I'd like you to meet Janet Morrison. She works with the county social services department. Janet approached Sarah with a warm smile. Mr. Blackwood called me early this morning about Lisa's situation. I've been working with him for several years now to help young people who find their way here. Sarah was surprised. You know about what Henry does here? Oh yes, Janet said. Henry is one of our most valuable resources, though very few people know about it. He's helped us place dozens of at-risk teenagers in safe homes over the years. This revelation changed everything Sarah thought she understood about the situation. Henry wasn't working alone. He was part of an unofficial network that helped young people in crisis. How many people know about this? Sarah asked. Just a few, Janet explained. Some people in social services, a couple of police officers, and a few medical professionals who sometimes treat the young people Henry helps. We all agreed years ago to keep this arrangement quiet. Henry looked embarrassed. I know it seems deceptive, but we've found that this approach works better than anything official the county has tried. Kids who won't trust any adult in authority will come here because they think they're hiding from the system. Emma and Jake emerged from the tent, curious about the conversation they could hear outside. Sarah introduced them to Janet, explaining that she was there to help Lisa find a safe place to live. I think I found a good placement for Lisa, Janet told Henry. There's a foster family in the next county who specialize in helping teenagers who have had bad experiences in the system. They're willing to meet with Lisa today. Lisa, who had been quiet during the conversation, finally spoke up. What if I don't like them? What if they're just like all the other places? Then you can come back here, Henry said gently. You'll always have a safe place to stay while we figure out something better. Sarah watched as Janet and Lisa talked about the potential placement. It was clear that Janet was experienced in dealing with frightened teenagers, and she gradually managed to convince Lisa to at least meet the new foster family. After Janet and Lisa left together, Sarah found herself alone with Henry again. Emma and Jake were exploring the area around the cabin with Max, staying within sight but giving the adults privacy to talk. I feel like I owe you an apology, Sarah said. I came here thinking I was going to expose some kind of dangerous situation. Instead, I've discovered something beautiful. Henry shook his head. You don't owe me anything. You were being a protective mother. I understand that completely. But I could have caused real problems for you and for the young people you help, Sarah said. If I had brought the police here or if I had told people in town what I found, you still could, Henry pointed out. You could go back to Pine Ridge and tell everyone the truth about what happens here. You could destroy everything I've built. Sarah looked at Henry carefully. Is that what you think I'm going to do? I don't know, Henry said honestly. But I hope you'll consider what's at stake. Lisa is just one of many young people who have found safety here over the years. If this place becomes public knowledge, it will lose its effectiveness. Sarah spent the rest of the morning thinking about Henry's words. She understood now why the people of Pine Ridge were so afraid of this place. They had been deliberately kept in the dark about Henry's activities, which allowed their fears and superstitions to grow unchecked. But that fear served a purpose. It protected Henry's ability to help people who had nowhere else to turn. As they packed up their camping gear, Emma and Jake peppered Sarah with questions about everything they had witnessed. Are we going to tell people in town about Henry? Emma asked. I don't know yet, Sarah said. It's complicated. But he's helping people, Jake said. Isn't that good? Yes, it's very good, Sarah agreed. But sometimes doing good things requires keeping secrets. On the drive back to Pine Ridge, Sarah wrestled with her conscience. She had always believed in honesty and transparency. She had raised her children to tell the truth and to trust in the system to protect people who needed help. But Henry's situation challenged all of those beliefs. When they arrived home, Sarah was surprised to find Officer Martinez waiting in their driveway. He approached her car with a serious expression. Mrs. Mitchell, I heard you went back to the Blackwood cabin, he said. I need to know what you found there. Sarah looked at Emma and Jake, who were watching the conversation with wide eyes. She thought about Henry, alone in his cabin, continuing his quiet work of helping desperate young people. She thought about Lisa, who was hopefully finding a safe new home. And she thought about all the future teenagers who might need the refuge that Henry provided. We camped near the cabin, Sarah said carefully. It's just an old building. Nothing dangerous about it at all. Officer Martinez studied her face. That's all? Nothing unusual. Sarah met his eyes steadily. Nothing that would concern the police. Officer Martinez nodded slowly. Sarah had the distinct impression that he knew more about the situation than he was letting on. Well, I'm glad you and your family are safe. Maybe now you'll consider exploring some of the other beautiful areas around Pine Ridge. After he left, Emma looked up at Sarah with a confused expression. Mom, you didn't tell him about Henry. No, I didn't, Sarah said. And I need you and Jake to promise me that you won't tell anyone about Henry either. Not your friends, not your teachers, not anyone. Why? Jake asked. Sarah knelt down so she was at eye level with her children. Because sometimes the most important work happens in secret. Henry is helping people who can't be helped any other way. If everyone knew about it, he wouldn't be able to help them anymore. Sarah had made her choice. She would keep Henry secret, even though it meant living with the knowledge that her neighbors would continue to fear something that was actually a force for good in their community. It was a complicated decision, but Sarah believed it was the right one. However, Sarah's decision to protect Henry's secret would soon be tested in ways she never imagined. 3 weeks after their camping trip, Sarah's resolve to keep Henry's secret was put to the ultimate test. She was at the grocery store when she overheard Mrs. Henderson talking to a group of other women about a missing teenager. That Peterson girl has been gone for 4 days now, Mrs. Henderson was saying. The police think she ran away, but her mother is worried sick. You know how dangerous it is for young people to be wandering around these mountains. Sarah's heart sank. She knew exactly where 15-year-old Amy Peterson had probably gone. Amy was Tommy Peterson's older sister, and Sarah remembered Tommy mentioning that Amy had been having problems at home. I heard the police searched all the usual places, another woman said, but they haven't found any trace of her. Sarah finished her shopping quickly and drove home, her mind racing. If Amy had gone to Henry's cabin, she was probably safe, but her family was obviously terrified, and the entire town was starting to panic about a missing child. That evening, Sarah made a decision that she hoped she wouldn't regret. She drove back to Blackwood Forest alone, leaving Emma and Jake with a babysitter. She needed to know if Amy was at the cabin, and if so, she needed to convince Henry to contact the authorities. When Sarah arrived at the cabin, she found Henry sitting on his porch with a teenage girl who matched Amy Peterson's description. The girl looked healthy and safe, but she was clearly upset about something. Mrs. Mitchell, Henry said, standing up when he saw her. I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. Is this Amy Peterson? Sarah asked directly. The girl looked up with frightened eyes. How do you know my name? The whole town is looking for you, Amy. Your family is worried sick. Amy's face crumpled. I can't go back there. My stepfather. He's been hurting me. My mom doesn't believe me and nobody else will listen. Sarah felt a wave of sympathy for the girl, but she also thought about Amy's mother, who was probably not sleeping or eating while her daughter was missing. Amy, there are people who can help you, Sarah said gently. You don't have to go back to a dangerous situation, but you also can't just disappear. Your mother needs to know you're alive. Henry had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. I've already called Janet Morrison. She's working on finding Amy a safe placement, but it takes time to arrange these things properly. How much time? Sarah asked. Maybe another day or two, Henry said. Janet wants to make sure Amy's stepfather can't interfere with whatever placement we find. Sarah understood the complexity of the situation, but she also knew that every hour Amy remained missing, the search would intensify. Eventually, someone would think to search Blackwood Forest more thoroughly. If Amy was found here, it could expose Henry's entire operation and put all future refugees at risk. What if we contact Amy's mother directly? Sarah suggested. What if we arrange a meeting somewhere neutral so Amy can explain her situation without having to go home? Amy shook her head vigorously. She won't believe me. She never believes me. But what if you had witnesses? Sarah pressed. What if you had adults who could back up your story? Henry looked interested in this idea. Janet has been documenting Amy's case. She has photographs of Amy's injuries and statements from Amy about what's been happening at home. Over the next hour, they worked out a plan. Sarah would contact Amy's mother and arrange a meeting at the Pine Ridge Community Center the next day. Janet Morrison would be there with all of Amy's documentation, and Henry would accompany Amy to provide moral support. But what about your secret? Amy asked Henry. If people see you in town, won't that cause problems? Henry smiled sadly. Sometimes you have to take risks to do the right thing. Your safety is more important than my anonymity. The next day, Sarah found herself in the unusual position of mediating a family crisis. in the Pine Ridge Community Center. Amy's mother, Carol Peterson, was initially angry and defensive. But when Janet Morrison presented the evidence of abuse, and when Amy bravely told her story in front of witnesses, Carol's anger turned to horror and guilt. "I had no idea it was this bad," Carol said through her tears. "I thought Amy was just being difficult because she didn't like her stepfather." "The important thing now is to make sure Amy is safe," Janet said. "I've found a temporary placement with a foster family who specialize in helping teenagers who have experienced abuse. Amy can stay there while we work out a more permanent solution." The meeting was difficult and emotional, but it ended with Amy being placed in a safe home and her stepfather being reported to the authorities. Carol Peterson promised to get counseling and to support Amy through the legal process that would follow. As they left the community center, Henry pulled Sarah aside. "Thank you for pushing us to handle this the right way. I was so focused on keeping Amy safe that I wasn't thinking about the bigger picture. What will you do now?" Sarah asked. "If people in town know you were involved in helping Amy, your secret might be out." Henry shrugged. "Maybe it's time for things to change. Maybe the town is ready to know the truth about what I do." Over the following weeks, word gradually spread through Pine Ridge about Henry's role in helping Amy Peterson. The reaction was mixed. Some people remained suspicious and hostile, but others began to see Henry in a new light. A few families even approached Janet Morrison about getting Henry's help for their own troubled teenagers. Sarah watched these developments with interest and some concern. She worried that publicity might interfere with Henry's ability to help the young people who needed him most. But she also realized that secrets, even well-intentioned ones, could sometimes cause more harm than good. 6 months later, Sarah returned to the cabin in Blackwood Forest with Emma and Jake for another camping trip. This time they found Henry working with a small group of volunteers from town to renovate the cabin and create a more official refuge for at-risk youth. "It's not the same as it was before," Henry admitted as they sat around the campfire that evening. "But maybe it doesn't need to be. Maybe there's a way to help people without hiding in the shadows." Sarah looked around at the peaceful forest clearing and thought about all the young people who had found safety here over the years. The cabin would always be a place where fear had been transformed into hope, where one man's determination to make amends had created something beautiful and important. "I think you're right," Sarah said. "Sometimes the best way to face our fears is to bring them into the light." As they sat under the stars that night, Sarah reflected on how much her understanding of courage had changed since they first arrived in Pine Ridge. Real courage, she realized, wasn't about being fearless. It was about doing the right thing even when you were afraid. Even when the right thing was complicated and uncertain. The cabin that everyone had feared had taught them all an important lesson about the power of compassion and the importance of looking beyond our assumptions to find the truth. And sometimes, Sarah thought, the truth was more beautiful than anyone could have imagined.